Imagine waking up one morning, brushing your teeth, making coffee, and thinking, today is going to be a normal day. But before your coffee even gets cold, a war has already started, ended, and become a world record. This is not a joke. This actually happened. Welcome to the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, the war that lasted about 38 minutes. That is shorter than some people take to choose what to eat for lunch. Most wars start because of land, money, religion, power, or someone doing something incredibly stupid. This war started because one man walked into a palace and basically said, "I am the Sultan now." And the British Empire looked at him and said, "No, you are not." Khalid said, "Yes, I am." The British said, "Leave the palace." Khalid said, "No." So the British brought warships. At this point, it was no longer a palace argument. It was a very short war with a very obvious ending. This is a story about ambition, imperial power, terrible timing, and one of the fastest military defeats ever recorded. So grab your tea, check your watch, and get ready. Because this war might be over before the intro is. Before we get to the 38-minute disaster, we need to talk about Zanzibar. Zanzibar is a small island off the coast of East Africa, and at first glance it looks like the kind of place where you go to relax, drink coconut water, and pretend your problems do not exist. Beautiful beaches, blue water, warm sunlight, and absolutely no sign that one day it would become the location of history's shortest war. But in the 19th century, Zanzibar was not just a pretty island. It was a major trading hub in the Indian Ocean. Ships came from Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond, carrying goods, spices, ivory, and influence. In simple terms, Zanzibar was small, but very useful. And whenever something was useful in the 19th century, European empires suddenly became very interested. Especially Britain. The British Empire at this time was basically playing the world's largest game of Monopoly. They looked at a port, a canal, an island, or a random piece of land, and said, "That looks important. We should probably control it." And when someone asked, "Are you sure this belongs to you?" the answer was usually, "It will." Zanzibar, however, still had its own ruler, the Sultan. He had a palace, officials, guards, ceremonies, and all the things that make a ruler look very official. But there was one tiny problem. The Sultan could rule Zanzibar as long as Britain was happy with him. This is what people called a protectorate, which sounds nice because protectorate sounds like someone is protecting you. But in practice, it often meant you are independent as long as you do exactly what we want. So Zanzibar had a sultan, but Britain had the final approval button. And that button was about to become very important, because when the old sultan died, everyone suddenly had one big question. Who gets to sit on the throne next? Now, to understand why Britain cared so much about one small island, we need to zoom out. Because in the late 19th century, Europe was doing something very normal and healthy, dividing an entire continent like it was a birthday cake. This was called the Scramble for Africa. Britain wanted ports, trade routes and strategic islands. Germany, which had arrived late to the Empire Party, also wanted a seat at the table. France wanted land. Portugal wanted land. Belgium wanted land. Everyone wanted land. And Africa, unfortunately, was the table. In 1890, Britain and Germany made a deal. Germany would focus on parts of mainland East Africa. Britain would keep influence over Zanzibar. which sounds very official except for one small detail. Nobody asked Zanzibar. This is one of those moments in history where two empires looked at someone else's home and said, "We have reached an agreement." And Zanzibar said, "About what?" But by this point, Zanzibar was officially under British protection, which meant Britain did not technically own Zanzibar. They just controlled its foreign policy, its leadership approval, and basically everything important. So, not owning it, just owning the decisions. The Sultan could still wear fancy clothes, sit on a fancy throne, and have fancy ceremonies. But when it came to big decisions, Britain was standing behind him with a clipboard. And if the Sultan made Britain happy, everything was peaceful. If he did not, well, that is when the warships started showing up. For a while, this system worked very well for Britain. Zanzibar had a sultan who cooperated with them. Britain got stability, influence, and a very convenient island. Everyone in London was probably very pleased with themselves, which in history usually means something is about to go wrong. Because on August 25th, 1896, the Sultan died. And when a ruler dies, there are two possible outcomes. Option 1, a peaceful transfer of power. Option 2, everyone starts panicking, grabbing weapons and running toward the palace. Zanzibar chose option 2. And that is where Khalid enters the story. Khalid bin Barghash was not the kind of man who saw an empty throne and said, "Maybe we should wait, Ma's farm." No, he saw an empty throne and thought, "That looks comfortable." So, very quickly, Khalid moved into the palace. He gathered his supporters, called in loyal guards, and basically said, "Good news, everyone, I am in charge now." This was a bold move. It was also a terrible move. Because there was one tiny little rule Khalid seemed to forget. The new Sultan of Zanzibar needed British approval. And Khalid did not have it. In London and at the British consulate, this was not seen as a charming local tradition. It was seen as a problem, a very annoying problem. Britain wanted a different man on the throne, Hamud bin Mohammed. Hamud was much more acceptable to the British, which is a polite historical way of saying he will probably do what we want. Khalid, on the other hand, looked a little too independent, and empires do not usually enjoy independent people making independent decisions. So the British told Khalid to step down. Khalid responded by doing the exact opposite. He fortified the palace. He brought in armed men. He positioned cannons. He even had a royal yacht called the Glasgow, which sounds impressive, until you remember Britain had actual warships. Khalid probably believed the British were bluffing. This is a dangerous belief to have when the British are parking cannons outside your house. But Khalid stayed. His supporters stayed. The palace doors closed. And outside the harbour the British ships waited. Everyone was now waiting for the same thing, the deadline. By now, the situation in Zanzibar had become very simple. Khalid was inside the palace. The British were outside with warships, and everyone was pretending this could still end peacefully. The British decided to give Khalid one final chance, a deadline. A very British way of saying, "Please do exactly what we want, or we will become extremely impolite." The message was clear. Khalid had to leave the palace by 9 o'clock in the morning. Not 9-ish, not whenever he felt emotionally ready. 9 o'clock. If he left, he could probably avoid disaster. If he stayed, Britain would open fire. This is what historians call an easy decision. Khalid chose the other one. Inside the palace, Khalid's supporters prepared for a heroic defence, or at least they prepared for what they hoped would look like a heroic defence. They had rifles, they had cannons, they had confidence. Unfortunately, confidence is not very effective against naval artillery. Outside the harbour, the British ships waited quietly. Their cannons were ready, their officers were watching the clock, and their patience was about as long as the war was going to be. Meanwhile, the people of Zanzibar were stuck in the middle. They did not choose Khalid's gamble. They did not control Britain's cannons. But if shooting started, they would be the ones living next to it. That is the part funny history stories often forget. The decisions are made by powerful men in fancy rooms. The consequences usually land on everyone else. So the clock kept moving. 8:55, 8:58, 8:59. And Khalid was still inside the palace, which meant Britain's final warning had officially expired. And now the shortest war in history was about to begin. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the ultimatum expired. Khalid was still inside the palace. The British looked at the palace. Then they looked at the clock. Then they looked back at the palace, and decided diplomacy had done enough. The order was given, the cannons fired, and the Anglo-Zanzibar War officially began. Now, when you hear the word war, you might imagine two armies charging at each other across a battlefield, flags waving, soldiers shouting, generals making complicated plans. This was not that kind of war. This was more like one side knocking on the door, and the other side answering with a cannonball. The palace was not built to survive naval artillery. It was built to look impressive, to host ceremonies, to make rulers look powerful, not to get punched repeatedly by the Royal Navy. The first shells hit the palace. Windows shattered, walls cracked, smoke began to rise, and inside, Khalid's heroic defence immediately became much less heroic. The defenders tried to fire back, which was brave, also completely useless. Firing old palace cannons at British warships was like throwing pebbles at a thunderstorm. The British ships kept firing, the palace kept burning, and the war kept moving very quickly toward its obvious conclusion. At this point, Khalid's plan had entered what experts call the bad part. And somehow it was about to get worse. While the palace was being turned into very expensive firewood, there was another problem in the harbour. Khalid still had a ship, a royal yacht called the Glasgow. And if you are imagining a mighty battleship that could challenge the British Navy, please stop imagining that. The Glasgow was important to Zanzibar, sure, but compared to the British warships, it was basically a fancy floating target. The British ships noticed it. The British cannons turned toward it. And the Glasgow suddenly had the worst morning of its life. The first shots hit the water around it. Then the ship itself was hit. Smoke rose from the deck. The crew tried to respond, which was brave, also, unfortunately, not enough. British firepower was simply too much. The Glasgow was damaged badly. Then it began to sink. So Zanzibar's navy went from "we have a ship" to "we had a ship" in just a few minutes. This was not great for morale. In fact, it was the opposite of morale. Inside the palace, the defenders could see smoke rising from their own ship. Outside, British shells were still smashing into the palace. So Khalid's situation had gone from bad to historically embarrassing. And remember, this entire war was still younger than most lunch breaks. The palace was burning. The ship was sinking. The British were still firing. And Khalid was probably beginning to suspect that maybe, just maybe, this plan had a few flaws. But it was too late to press the undo button, because the British bombardment was not slowing down. It was only getting worse. And now Khalid had to make a very important decision. Should he stay and become a martyr, or should he run away and become a much safer historical footnote? He chose the footnote. And honestly, that was probably the smartest decision he made all week. By this point, Khalid had learned an important lesson. When the British Empire says, "Leave the palace," maybe leave the palace. Unfortunately, he learned this lesson after the palace was already on fire. The walls were shaking, smoke was filling the rooms. His ship was sinking, his defenders were panicking, and the British were still calmly firing shells like they were following a schedule. So Khalid made his second major decision of the week. The first decision was taking the palace. That one had gone badly. The second decision was running away. This one was much better. Khalid did not stay to become a heroic symbol of resistance. He did not stand on the balcony and give a dramatic speech. He did not say, "Men, today we fight for Zanzibar." No, he left. Very quickly. Possibly faster than the war itself. But there was a problem. He could not just walk into the street and wave goodbye. The British wanted him removed, and probably would have preferred to remove him personally. So Khalid went somewhere the British could not simply storm into, the German consulate. This was awkward, because Britain and Germany were not exactly best friends at this time. They were more like two co-workers who smile during meetings and secretly hate each other. So when Khalid ran into German protection, Britain could not just kick the door down. That would cause a diplomatic incident, and no one wants a diplomatic incident before lunch. So Khalid escaped immediate capture, not because he won, not because his plan worked, but because international politics is weird. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the war was still going on. But without Khalid, the whole thing was starting to lose its main character. The defenders were still inside, the British were still outside, the palace was still burning. But the man who started the crisis was already looking for a safe place to sit down. And that is usually not a great sign for your revolution. With Khalid gone, the defence of the palace entered a new strategic phase. Confusion. The man who had started the whole crisis was now safely somewhere else, which is not usually great for team spirit. The defenders were still being shelled. The palace was still burning. The Glasgow was already sinking in the harbour, and the British Navy was still very much awake. At this point, the palace defenders had a choice. Continue fighting a world empire with a burning building and some old cannons, or stop doing that. They chose to stop doing that. The palace flag came down. The firing slowed. And then, just like that, the war was over. It had lasted about 38 minutes. That is not a war. That is a very aggressive appointment cancellation. The shortest war in recorded history had ended before most people finished their morning routines. Somewhere, someone probably started making tea before the war began, and came back to find out the entire conflict was already over. But for Zanzibar, this was not just a funny stopwatch fact. The palace was damaged. The ship was gone. Hundreds of Zanzibar fighters and civilians had been killed or wounded. The British suffered almost nothing by comparison, which tells you everything you need to know about how unequal this fight was. Calling it a war almost makes it sound fair. It was not fair. It was a demonstration, a message, a very loud reminder that Britain expected Zanzibar to obey. And now that Khalid was gone, Britain could finally install the Sultan it actually wanted, which is exactly what happened next. With Khalid gone and the palace defeated, Britain now had a very convenient problem. The throne was empty, and luckily for Britain, they already had someone in mind. His name was Khalid bin Mohammed. He was polite, he was cooperative, and most importantly, he was not Khalid, which at that moment was probably the strongest qualification possible. So Britain installed Khalid as the new Sultan of Zanzibar, and this time everyone was very careful to agree, because there were still British warships in the harbour, and nothing encourages political agreement like naval artillery. The ceremony probably looked very official. Robes, guards, documents, speeches, all the normal things. But behind all the ceremony was one very simple message. Britain chooses. Zanzibar obeys. This is why the war, despite being ridiculously short, mattered. It was not about battlefield glory. It was not about military genius. It was about control. Britain wanted Zanzibar to know who was really in charge, and after 38 minutes of shelling, Zanzibar knew. Hamud's new government quickly aligned with British interests. Reforms followed. British influence grew stronger, and Zanzibar's independence became even more theoretical than before. On paper, Zanzibar still had a sultan. In practice, Britain held the pen. And if that sounds unfair, that is because it was. The war was short. The message lasted much longer. And that message was simple. Do not challenge the empire unless you are ready for the empire to answer. So, was this really the most useless war in history? Well, from a military point of view, yes. Because a normal war usually has strategy, movement, counterattacks, confusing uniforms, and at least one general pointing at a map like he knows what he is doing. This war had none of that. It had a palace, it had warships, and it had one very predictable outcome. This was less like a war and more like a very expensive demolition notice. Khalid had already lost the moment Britain decided he was not allowed to win. The battle itself was just the paperwork being delivered by cannon. But if you look at it from Britain's point of view, it was not useless at all. It removed Khalid. It installed Khalid. It reminded Zanzibar, who had the bigger guns. And it did all of that in less time than a long lunch break. That is terrifyingly efficient. The useless part is not that nothing happened. A lot happened. People were killed. Buildings were destroyed. A government changed. The useless part is that the outcome was never really in doubt. Khalid thought he was playing palace politics. Britain was playing empire politics. That is a very different game. It is like showing up to play checkers and discovering the other guy brought an aircraft carrier. So, yes, as a war, it was almost completely pointless. But as a message from an empire, it was brutally clear. Obey or be replaced. And in 1896, Zanzibar got that message very loudly. In fact, probably too loudly. Which brings us to the strange legacy of this tiny, ridiculous, deeply unfair war. Today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is usually remembered for one thing. It was short. Very short. So short that it sounds less like a war and more like a scheduling error. But if we only remember the stopwatch, we miss the point. Because this tiny war tells us something much bigger. It shows how empire worked. Not always with long wars, not always with massive invasions. Sometimes all it took was a ship, a deadline, and someone refusing to leave a building. The British did not need to conquer Zanzibar from scratch. They already had influence. They already had agreements. They already had warships nearby. So when Khalid challenged the system answered immediately. That is the real legacy of the war. Not just that it was short, but that it was so short because the power imbalance was so extreme. Khalid made a bad decision. Britain made an imperial decision. And ordinary people paid the price. That is why this story is funny, until it is not. The jokes are easy. 38 minutes, a war shorter than lunch, a sultan who lost his throne before most people finished their tea. But behind the joke is a system where small states had very little room to say no. If the empire approved you, you could rule. If the empire did not approve you, the harbour suddenly became very crowded. And that is a very specific kind of democracy. The Anglo-Zanzibar War is often treated like a historical fun fact. And it is one, but it is also a warning. A warning about arrogance, a warning about empires, and a warning about what happens when powerful people treat other people's countries like pieces on a board game. So, yes, it was ridiculous. Yes, it was short. Yes, it deserves its strange little place in history. But it was not harmless. It was short because one side had almost all the power, and the other side had almost no chance. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the shortest war in history, and it sets up the final question. What should we actually remember about it? So, what should we actually remember about the Anglo-Zanzibar War? That it was the shortest war in recorded history? Yes. That it lasted about 38 minutes? Also, yes. That Khalid chose a fight with the British Empire and then quickly discovered why that was a bad idea? Definitely yes. But if that is all we remember, then we only remember the joke. And this story was not only a joke. It was a tiny war with a huge message, a message about power, about empire, about what happens when a small state tries to say no to a very large machine. Khalid was arrogant, Britain was ruthless, and ordinary people were caught between the two. That is why history is strange. It can be ridiculous and tragic at the same time. It can make you laugh at a stopwatch and then remind you that real people stood under the falling shells. The Anglo-Zanzibar War ended almost as soon as it began, but the lesson lasted much longer. Power does not always need a long war to make itself understood. Sometimes 38 minutes is enough. Enough to destroy a palace, enough to sink a ship, enough to replace a ruler, and enough to show the world exactly how empire worked. So, yes, it was short. Yes, it was absurd. And yes, it is one of the easiest wars in history to summarize. Khalid took the palace. Britain said no. Khalid stayed. Britain fired. Khalid ran. Hamoud became Sultan, and the war ended before the tea got cold. But behind that simple summary is a much bigger story. A story about who gets to decide the future of a place, the people who live there or the people with the biggest guns. In Zanzibar in 1896, the answer was painfully clear, and that is why the shortest war in history still deserves to be remembered. Not because it was funny, not only because it was short, but because it reveals something uncomfortable about power. Sometimes history does not need a long battle to make a point. Sometimes it only needs 38 minutes. And a very big empire with very big guns.